At a tense family dinner inside my brother-in-law's luxury penthouse in Ashford Heights, the air felt heavy with his usual arrogance. Dominic Vales sat at the head of the long marble table, looking at me with a smirk that always made my skin crawl. Without warning, he reached out and slammed my printed bank statement onto the table for everyone to see. The white paper looked out of place against the expensive stone. Dominic laughed loudly, a sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the penthouse. "This is it, Evelyn. This is your entire financial plan?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. My chest began to burn as I saw his wife watching the scene in total silence, offering me no help at all. Dominic leaned back, crossing his arms over his expensive suit. "People like you don't understand real money," he added, shaking his head in mock pity. $12,000 is nothing. It is a joke. I felt humiliated and frozen in front of the entire family, unable to find the words to defend myself. But then, my phone began to ring in my pocket. The screen showed a private number from an elite auction house in downtown Chicago. I answered, and the voice on the other end was formal and respectful. "Ms. Hartwell, the estate recognizes your name. The bid clearance has been approved." Dominic had no idea that the small savings he just mocked was actually the key to a multi-million-dollar auction process tied to my true identity. The rest of the dinner was a blur of Dominic's loud voice and my own racing heart. He didn't stop at the table, he continued to tell the rest of the family that I was financially stuck in survival mode. He acted as if I were a charity case that needed his wisdom to survive. I kept my head down, finishing my meal while he bragged about his latest investments and luxury car purchases. The next morning, I went to my office and tried to focus on my work. I spent hours quietly verifying legal documents tied to a dormant inheritance portfolio that had been left to me. Most people thought I just did simple administrative work, but I was actually managing the legal release of an estate that had been frozen for years. While I was reviewing the files, the auction house sent another message to my secure line. "High-value estate listing under your authorization code detected," the notification read. I felt a surge of adrenaline. The process was moving forward, and the assets were finally beginning to surface in the system. Dominic thought he knew everything about my financial life, but he was looking at a tiny window while I was standing in front of a massive, open door. I tucked the documents away, knowing the truth would eventually come out, but not on his terms. I spent my lunch break in a quiet corner of a park, reviewing the sealed financial records that had belonged to my late grandmother. For years, these files had been locked away in a legal trust. As I scrolled through the digital copies, I saw things that made my hands shake. There were historic properties, rare art assets, and exclusive auction rights that no one in my family had ever mentioned to me. My grandmother had been much wealthier and more secretive than I ever imagined, and she had chosen me to be the one to bring it all back into the light. Meanwhile, the reality of my daily life remained the same. Dominic continued his pattern of mocking me publicly at every family event we attended. Whether it was a birthday party or a simple Sunday brunch, he always found a way to mention how unfortunate it was that I didn't have his business sense. He saw my $12,000 as a sign of failure, never guessing that it was simply the liquid cash I kept for daily expenses while a fortune was waiting for my signature. I closed my laptop and headed back to work, feeling like I was living a double life. The weight of the secret was heavy, but the thought of the upcoming auction gave me the strength to keep smiling through his insults. A week later, our family attended a high-profile charity gala. Dominic was in his element, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than my car and shaking hands with local politicians. He saw me standing near the buffet and decided it was the perfect time for another public performance. He raised his voice so the people nearby could hear him clearly. "Evelyn is still trying to build savings. It's kind of cute, really," he announced with a smug grin. A few people in the circle laughed, looking at me with pity. My face felt hot, but I didn't say a word to defend myself. Right at that moment, my phone vibrated in my clutch bag. I stepped away to check the message. Auction house awaiting identity confirmation, it said. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to wait for the perfect moment. I looked back at Dominic, who was busy telling a story about a real estate deal he had supposedly mastered. He had no idea that the very system he worshipped was currently waiting for me to hit a button. I took a deep breath and realized that his laughter wouldn't last much longer. The auction house was the only audience that really mattered, and they were ready to call my name. I put my phone away and walked back into the crowd, wearing a mask of calm. The next day, I received a formal email from the auction house confirming that my name was officially tied to a legacy bidding account. This wasn't just a regular account, it was a dormant fund worth significantly more than anyone in my family could possibly imagine. The sheer scale of the assets was overwhelming. There were shares in international shipping companies and deeds to land that had been in the family for generations. Dominic was still calling me financially irrelevant to anyone who would listen. He told my sister that I would probably never own a home and that I was destined to rent forever. I sat at my desk and looked at the digital balance of the legacy account. The numbers were so large they didn't even feel real. It was a strange sensation to be treated like a pauper while possessing the wealth of a queen. I realized that my grandmother had been very clever. By placing her assets under such a complex trust system, she had protected them from people like Dominic who would have tried to take them for themselves. I felt a deep sense of gratitude toward her. She had given me the power to change my life, but she had also given me the chance to see people for who they truly were before I revealed the truth. I spent the evening reading through the fine print of the inheritance clause in my grandmother's will. The legal documents revealed a very specific plan. My grandmother had placed her entire portfolio under a protected auction trust system. This meant that the assets couldn't just be handed over, they had to be processed through a formal bidding authority to ensure their true market value was realized. Most importantly, only I had the legal authority to activate that bidding process. I hadn't even known this system existed until the auction house reached out to me. It was a brilliant move to keep the family wealth hidden from prying eyes and greedy relatives. I realized that my $12,000 was actually just the activation fee required to open the legal gates of the trust. Dominic saw it as my life savings, but in reality, it was the key to the vault. I felt a surge of pride. My grandmother had trusted me with this responsibility because she knew I would handle it with care. I looked at the dark windows of my apartment and felt a sense of peace. The storm of Dominic's insults was still raging, but I was standing in a lighthouse that he couldn't see. My finger hovered over the "Activate" button on the legal portal, and I finally pressed it. The insults didn't stop just because I had activated the trust. Dominic was especially cruel during a family brunch the following Sunday. He spent 20 minutes talking about his new investment strategy and then turned his attention to me. "Some people are just born without money sense," he said, looking at me over his coffee cup. My sister sighed, but she didn't stop him. While he was talking, my phone buzzed with a priority notification. "First estate item scheduled for auction release," the message stated. I felt a chill run down my spine. The machinery of the estate was finally waking up. The first item wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a major piece of property. I stayed silent, letting Dominic continue his lecture on how to properly manage a small bank account. He thought I was failing in life, but I was quietly acquiring a world that he could only dream of entering. It was almost funny to watch him act so superior while the digital gears of a massive auction were beginning to turn in my favor. He was so focused on my tiny savings that he missed the shift in the air. The first asset was about to go live, and my name was the only one that could authorize the sale. A few days later, a senior representative from the auction house called me directly. His voice was professional and carried a tone of great importance. "Ms. Hartwell, we've been waiting for your authorization for years," he said. He explained that the trust had been in a state of suspended animation since my grandmother passed away. I realized that my own silence and hesitation had been holding back massive dormant assets that were supposed to be flowing through the market. We are ready to move forward with the first major release, he continued. We just need your final confirmation. I gave him the approval, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about honoring my grandmother's legacy and the plan she had set in motion long ago. Dominic was still going on about how I was financially stuck, but I was now the person responsible for one of the most anticipated auction series in the city's history. I hung up the phone and looked at my reflection in the office window. I looked like the same EVELYN, but everything had changed. I was no longer a bystander in my own life. I was the one pulling the levers of a multi-million-dollar machine, and the world was about to start noticing. The first asset to be revealed was not a small one. It was a historic property tied directly to my family estate. It was a beautiful piece of land with a grand old building that had been kept in perfect condition by the trust. When the listing went live on the auction house's internal portal, the estimated value shocked even the professional auction analysts. They hadn't seen a property of this caliber hit the market in decades. I spent my afternoon reviewing the marketing materials and the historical data for the property. It was strange to see my family history turned into a high-value investment listing, but I knew it was what my grandmother wanted. She wanted the assets to be used, not just sat upon. While the experts were scrambling to understand where this new estate had come from, I was sitting in my modest office chair, answering routine emails. No one at work knew that I was the beneficiary of the property that everyone in the real estate world was suddenly talking about. I felt a sense of quiet power. I didn't need to brag like Dominic, I just needed to wait. The first asset was just the beginning, and its value was already proving that Dominic's wisdom was worth nothing compared to the truth of my inheritance. Dominic continued his routine of mocking my savings every chance he got, completely unaware of what was happening in the background. He even offered to help me set up a more aggressive savings plan, laughing the whole time as if it were a great joke. Meanwhile, I was spending my evenings reviewing asset listings that exceeded anything in his financial world. I saw reports on rare art collections and international property shares that made his penthouse look like a starter apartment. It was fascinating to watch him act so confident while he was actually the one who was financially irrelevant to the high-stakes world I was now part of. I kept my mouth shut, even when he made jokes about me never being able to afford a vacation. I knew that within a few months, I could buy the entire travel agency if I wanted to. The contrast between his perception and my reality was becoming a source of internal amusement. He was so busy looking down on me that he couldn't see the mountain I was standing on. I realized that true wealth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just waits for the right moment to speak. Dominic was shouting, but the market was starting to whisper my name, and those whispers were much louder than his voice. The day finally came when the auction house activated my legacy account in full. This was the final step in the legal process. Suddenly, a wave of dormant assets began transferring into the visible part of the system. It was like a dam had broken. On my screen, I watched as row after row of high-value items appeared under my name. There were gold certificates, rare coins, and ownership stakes in tech firms that had grown significantly since my grandmother's time. Dominic remained completely unaware of the shift. He was still making comments about my tiny bank account and how I should be more grateful for the real success of people like him. I looked at the total value of the activated account and had to blink several times to make sure I wasn't dreaming. The number was astronomical. I felt a strange sense of calm. The secret was no longer just a legal document, it was a living, breathing financial reality. I was no longer just EVELYN Hartwell, the broke sister-in-law. I was the primary authority over an empire that was finally coming back to life. I closed my laptop and went for a walk, feeling the cool air and the solid ground. Dominic thought I was struggling, but I was now the most powerful person in the room. The market began to react to the sudden appearance of the Hartwell assets. Investors and collectors started tracking the unusual high-value listings that were all tied to my name. Whispers began to spread in exclusive auction circles about a new player who had just unlocked a massive, legendary portfolio. People were trying to find out who I was and where I had come from. My identity was slowly starting to surface in the restricted registries of the city's elite. I started receiving guarded inquiries from brokers and financial advisors who wanted to introduce themselves. I ignored them all, preferring to keep my privacy for as long as possible. Dominic, of course, noticed nothing. He was too busy following the big news of local real estate to notice the seismic shift happening in the auction world. I realized that he wasn't as well connected as he liked to pretend. If he were truly part of the elite, he would have heard my name by now. His ignorance was proof that his success was much smaller than he led everyone to believe. I felt a sense of vindication. The world was starting to look for me, but the man who mocked me every day was still looking right past me. The following family dinner was particularly difficult. Dominic was in a foul mood and decided to take it out on me once again. He laughed at my silence and made a comment that made the whole table go cold. $12,000 won't even buy a used car in this market, Evelyn, he said, shaking his head. My sister looked at her plate, embarrassed for me. Right as he finished speaking, my phone buzzed in my lap. I glanced down and saw a message from the trust. Second estate asset unlocked, it said. This one was a collection of rare impressionist paintings that had been hidden in a climate-controlled vault for decades. I stayed silent, taking a sip of water and looking Dominic directly in the eye. I didn't feel the usual sting of his words. Instead, I felt a sense of irony so strong it was almost hard to swallow. He was mocking me for not being able to buy a car, while I had just become the legal owner of art that could buy his entire penthouse 10 times over. I realized then that his power over me was completely gone. His words were just noise, and I was the one holding the remote control. I finished my dinner in peace, knowing the end was near. A major shift occurred in the auction registry system. My name officially appeared in the restricted sections that only high-level brokers could access. The patterns were becoming clear to anyone who knew how to read the market. All the high-value listings from the Hartwell estate were being authorized by the same person. Brokers began noticing the connection and started asking more direct questions. I received a call from a well-known art dealer who sounded almost breathless. Ms. Hartwell, we've seen the recent listings. Are you planning on releasing the full collection? I told him I would make a decision in due time and hung up. Dominic still thought I was broke, and he continued to make comments about my survival mode lifestyle. He even suggested that I might need to move into a smaller apartment to save money. I almost laughed out loud at that. I was currently looking at the deed to a historic mansion that was part of the estate. The gap between his fantasy of my life and the reality of my wealth was now a canyon. I was no longer just a beneficiary, I was a market force. And Dominic was still stuck in the small pond he thought was an ocean. I was finally contacted by a senior auction broker who didn't dance around the subject. Are you the Hartwell estate beneficiary? He asked directly. I hesitated for a moment, knowing that my answer would change everything. I might be, I finally replied, keeping my voice neutral. He went quiet for a second, then his tone became even more respectful. We have multiple buyers interested in the property and the art. The market has been waiting for this for a long time. I thanked him for the information and told him to wait for my signal. I felt a surge of adrenaline. The process of becoming public had begun. I knew that once the auction house confirmed my identity, the news would travel fast. Dominic would hear it eventually, and I wanted to be there to see his face. I spent the afternoon reviewing the final marketing plans for the main estate auction. It was going to be the biggest event of the year, and I was the one who had made it happen. I felt a deep sense of pride in my grandmother's legacy and in my own ability to keep the secret until the very end. The broke sister-in-law was about to become the most talked-about person in the city. Dominic finally began to hear the rumors that were swirling in the financial world. He mentioned it at brunch, though he still didn't connect it to me. I heard there's a major estate listing tied to the name Hartwell. Some old money family coming out of the woodwork, he said, laughing. He looked at me and added, "Too bad you're not that kind of Hartwell, Evelyn. You could use a break like that." He laughed at his own joke, but I noticed something shift in his tone. He sounded a little less confident than usual. Maybe he was starting to realize that the world of real money was moving in ways he didn't understand. I didn't say a word. I just focused on my meal and let him talk. He was so sure of his own superiority that he couldn't see the truth even when it was literally in his mouth. I realized that people like Dominic are blinded by their own pride. They only see what they expect to see. He expected me to be a failure, so that's all he saw. He couldn't imagine that the broke girl across the table was the same person the entire auction world was currently obsessed with. His laughter was starting to sound thin, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it stopped completely. The silent expansion of my portfolio continued at a rapid pace. More and more assets were being activated under my legacy account every day. I saw rare art, property shares, and historical collections appearing in the system like stars in a night sky. The auction house sent me a final confirmation: "Your portfolio is now fully online." This was it. The entire Hartwell estate was now visible to the restricted market, and my name was attached to every single item. I spent my evening looking at the total valuation of the portfolio. It was a number that would make most people's heads spin. I felt a sense of profound responsibility. This wasn't just about wealth, it was about preserving a piece of history and using it for something good. I thought about all the times Dominic had mocked me for my tiny savings, and I realized how small he really was. He was obsessed with the appearance of wealth, while I was now the custodian of a true legacy. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I had kept the secret, I had managed the process, and I had honored my grandmother's wishes. The world was now ready for the final act, and I was the one who would take the stage. The following weekend, Dominic once again decided to mock my tiny savings in front of our cousins. He was telling them how I needed to be more realistic about my future. "Evelyn thinks she's doing well with her 12,000, but in the real world, that's just pocket change," he said with a smirk. Right as he said those words, my phone lit up with a notification that made my heart leap. "Bidding authority unlocked for first major estate auction," it read. This was no longer theoretical. The first official auction event was scheduled, and I was the one who would be sitting in the primary bidder's seat. I looked at Dominic and felt a strange sense of pity. He was so proud of his little world, and he had no idea that I was about to dismantle it. I didn't say a word in response to his insult. I just smiled a little and put my phone away. The time for talking was almost over. The real world that Dominic kept talking about was about to show him exactly who was in charge. I felt a rush of confidence. I was no longer the victim of his bullying, I was the author of his biggest surprise. I received an exclusive invitation to preview the private estate auction collection at the auction house's main gallery. This was an event reserved only for the most elite bidders and the families of the estates. Dominic, despite all his talk of real money, had no idea that I was now part of that exclusive system. He probably didn't even know the event was happening. I spent the afternoon walking through the gallery, looking at the beautiful things that my grandmother had collected over her lifetime. There were jewels that sparkled like ice and paintings that felt like they were breathing. The gallery staff treated me with the utmost respect, addressing me by name and offering me anything I needed. It was a far cry from the way I was treated at Dominic's penthouse. I felt like I had finally stepped into the world where I belonged. I looked at a rare diamond necklace that was part of the collection and realized that it alone was worth more than everything Dominic owned. I felt a sense of quiet triumph. The broke girl was now the guest of honor in a place where Dominic would never even be allowed to enter the lobby. The market shock finally began. Auction analysts and high-level investors detected the sudden movement in the Hartwell-linked assets. They started tracing the ownership back through the legal trusts, and my name began to appear more and more frequently in their reports. The news was starting to break into the more general financial circles. I saw a small article in a business journal about the mysterious beneficiary of the Hartwell estate who was about to release a legendary collection. They didn't have my photo yet, but they had my name. I knew it was only a matter of days before Dominic saw it. I felt a sense of anticipation. I wanted him to find out on his own, to see the reality of his mistake printed in black and white. I continued to go to work and live my normal life, but I could feel the momentum building. The world was starting to move toward me, and I was ready for it. I realized that true power isn't about being loud, it's about being undeniable. And the Hartwell estate was becoming the most undeniable story of the year. Dominic was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Dominic's behavior started to change. He was no longer just mocking me, he was starting to ask pointed questions about my finances. He had clearly heard some of the rumors and was trying to figure out if there was any truth to them. For the first time, he didn't sound confident when he spoke to me. "Evelyn, I've been hearing some strange things about a Hartwell trust. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" he asked at dinner. I kept my face perfectly still and took a slow sip of my wine. "I told you, Dominic, I'm just focused on my savings," I said, repeating the words he had used against me so many times. He looked at me with a mix of suspicion and fear. He was starting to realize that he might have been wrong about me, and the thought clearly terrified him. He had spent years building his ego on the idea that I was beneath him, and if that weren't true, his whole world would crumble. I felt a sense of calm. I wasn't going to give him the answers he wanted. He would have to wait for the auction house to tell him the truth. His confidence was gone, and I was the one holding the cards. The final confrontation happened at his penthouse, just a few days before the auction. Dominic was pacing the room, his face red with frustration. He cornered me near the balcony and demanded to know the truth. "Where are you getting all this attention from, Evelyn? People are talking about you in the city. Why is your name in the papers?" he shouted. I stood my ground and looked him directly in the eye. I didn't feel any of the old fear. I felt nothing but a cold, clear sense of justice. "From things you never bothered to look at, Dominic," I answered calmly. He looked like I had slapped him. He started to say something else, but he couldn't find the words. He was finally starting to understand that the person he had mocked and humiliated was someone he didn't know at all. He had spent so much time looking down on my tiny savings that he had missed the mountain of gold I was standing on. I walked past him and out of the penthouse, leaving him alone with his pride and his fear. The time for secrets was over. The next time he saw me, it would be in the one place where his voice wouldn't matter at all. The auction house finally confirmed my identity publicly within their internal and partner systems. This was the final step before the grand auction event. I was officially listed as a primary estate authority, the sole person with the power to approve and authorize the sale of the Hartwell assets. The news hit the high-level financial sites immediately. My phone was flooded with messages, but I ignored them all. I was focused on the upcoming event. I had worked so hard to get to this point, and I wanted everything to be perfect. I spent my day in final meetings with the auction house staff, reviewing the logistics and the security for the event. They treated me like royalty, and I realized that my grandmother's plan had worked perfectly. She had given me the time to grow and the resources to succeed, and now I was ready to claim my legacy. I felt a deep sense of peace. The struggle was over, and the victory was finally within reach. Dominic was now just a footnote in a much bigger story, and I was the one who was writing the final chapter. The realization finally hit Dominic with full force. He was at a business meeting when he saw the auction registry screen accidentally. My name appeared in bold letters next to high-value estate assets that were being prepared for the final sale. He told my sister later that he had to sit down because he felt like he was going to faint. He finally saw the truth in black and white. The person he had laughed at for having nothing was actually the owner of the most valuable collection in the city. He went completely silent. He didn't call me, and he didn't send any more mocking messages. He was finally, truly, humbled. He realized that every insult he had ever thrown at me was now a reflection of his own ignorance. He had been the fool all along, and the entire city was about to find out. I felt a sense of profound satisfaction. I hadn't needed to shout or fight or seek revenge. I had just needed to be myself and wait for the truth to come out. Dominic's pride had been his own undoing, and my silence had been my greatest weapon. The stage was now set for the final act, and I was ready to take my place. At the final auction preview, the atmosphere was electric. The room was filled with the most powerful people in the city, all waiting to see the legendary Hartwell collection. I sat in the front row, wearing a simple but elegant dress that my grandmother would have loved. Dominic was there too, sitting in the back, looking like a man who had lost everything. When the announcer stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the room. "Next bidder, EVELYN Hartwell," he called out. The room shifted as everyone turned to look at me. I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, but I didn't flinch. I stood up and acknowledged the call with a calm nod. Dominic finally understood what he had mocked. He saw the respect, the power, and the legacy that I now carried. I didn't smile, and I didn't gloat. I simply looked back at the room and then at the stage. "You called it small savings, until the auction house called my name," I said, my voice clear and steady for everyone to hear. The auction began, and I knew that my grandmother was watching and smiling. I was no longer a victim, I was the master of my own destiny, and my name would be remembered long after the auction was over.